Brilliant, thank you. So very, very pleased to be here and kind of in awe of the amount of work, the amount of expertise that's going on. I'm really looking forward to being part of the discussions as well as to hearing the other panelists. So I've been asked to sort of give a general introduction, sort of set the scene for talking about climate and surface transport. So I think in practice, it will last 10 minutes. I was hoping it might be a bit shorter, but there's an awful lot to say. So I shall keep it as brief as I can. But it's important to start off, I think, by saying that surface transport is the UK's highest emitting sector, as classified by the Commission on Climate Change. So in terms of the separate sectors, separate economic sectors, transport is the single largest one. It accounts for around 22% of total UK greenhouse gas emissions. So this is primarily tailpipe emissions, exhaust emissions from fossil fueled road vehicles. So cars make up around 60% of those emissions, and vans and HGVs make up each around 18%. So, you know, this is a combination of personal and freight transport and so on, but cars make up the biggest single chunk of that. HGVs are disproportionate in terms of the distance travelled because they are particularly large vehicles. So that's a brief overview of where we're at the moment. The rather depressing news as well, some more rather depressing news, I'm afraid, is that emissions from surface transport have not been falling, unlike other sectors. So this graph from Bayes is sort of showing you the trends from 1990 to 2019, greenhouse gas emissions per sector. And you can see energy is that line that's going down, the dark green line. So it's not decarbonising as fast as many of us would like, but energy production has been decarbonised to some extent. Transport, on the other hand, is that light green line that's staying pretty much the same level. It's not really changed from 1990 levels, which is not great, really. And the Commission on Climate Change talks a little bit in their sixth carbon budget about this and the reasons. So there's a couple of things. So firstly, between 1990 and 2017, each individual new car that was bought was generally getting more efficient on average. But because there was an increase in the amount of driving, there was no fall in emissions because they cancelled each other out. Unfortunately, it gets worse because in recent years, new car efficiency actually fell because of a trend to larger, higher emitting vehicles, especially sports utility vehicles. And the growth in sports utility vehicles in recent years has offset the rise in sales of electric vehicles. So, you know, it's not a very positive picture overall in terms of the trends. A further piece of rather unfortunate context is around aviation emissions. So I'm only talking here about surface transport. Now, traditionally, we've cheated in terms of our carbon budgeting in that we've ignored aviation and just looked at surface transport. So surface transport is kind of bad enough in that things are not improving. But if you look at aviation, which is the right-hand side here, the gold-coloured side, well, international shipping is about the same in 1990 and 2019 in terms of carbon emissions. So again, not great. But international aviation, that's like flights between the UK and other countries, has more than doubled over that period in terms of its carbon emissions. And to be honest, in terms of aviation, whereas in terms of surface transport, at least we're talking about demand reduction, I'll get onto that in a minute, aviation is still what we call predict and provide in transport planning, still an assumption that it will expand, that airport capacity will grow, new runways, new terminals. And now this is now being included within our carbon budgeting, which basically means that everything else has to decarbonise faster and deeper because aviation, you know, is such a negative influence on the overall budget. So that's another piece of information that's important. So achieving net zero from surface transport, getting decarbonisation, which we've not been doing so well at doing, is going to be extremely challenging. It's going to require action in a whole range of areas: social, regulatory, technological, policy, infrastructure, behaviour change, a whole range of stuff across the board. And we're not just talking about personal travel. We're going to be talking, well, we are going to be talking this evening as well about freight. You know, it's also servicing. So it's not just the cars, it's also the lorries, it's also the vans, and struggling against unintended consequences. So all policies have unintended consequences. There's always negative impacts of positive things you're trying to do. And in terms of decarbonising surface transport, this is most of a problem for technological fixes that end up with negative behavioural changes. So to give you an example, a switch to electric car ownership has some potential negative impacts. So the fact that we've got we've got incentives for electric car ownership. So Norway is a good example of this. Actually, Norway strongly incentivised electric car ownership. You can drive in bus lanes, you can park for free, you can get lots of subsidies to buy electric cars. Well, one of the impacts of that has been that people have moved from buses to electric cars, that people now, households that would have maybe had one car now have two cars, and the second car is electric. So, the remaining vehicles, motor vehicles, need to be electric. But there are there are negative impacts of the way in which the electric car ownership is being encouraged, basically. But to move at about halfway mark to a positive, the positive side, one of the things that's exciting about working in this area is that there are major co-benefits. If we can decarbonise surface transport, there are major co-benefits. There's a lot of good stuff. And for me, that's really important. It can't just be about doing less, about having less, about things, being more of a struggle. There has to be co-benefits. There have to be things that we can offer people from this change. And if we can get a lot less driving, if we can get a lot more walking and cycling in particular, there will be such strong health benefits. And there's a couple of references in there to articles that talk about how, compared to say a shift to electric vehicles, if magically we could get an entirely electric vehicle fleet of all the vehicles we have now, that the benefits from that will be very limited compared to getting a lot less driving, as well as having electric vehicles, a lot less driving, a lot more walking, a lot more cycling, a lot more public transport use. So one example is the fact that car ownership is very, very socially skewed. And take, for instance, access to cars by gender. Women have much lower access to cars than men. In countries where you have a lot of cycling, women cycle more than men. But in the UK, women cycle very little. So if we can get a much more, a much more conducive context for active travel for cycling, we could expand women's mobility options significantly, because women have poorer car access. So there's health benefits, there's equity benefits. Health, for instance, physical activity. People don't get anywhere near the level of exercise they need to stay healthy. If people can walk or cycle, then there are very, very large health benefits. London has recognised some of many of these co-benefits, and London has really ambitious targets for reducing car use. So this is from the Mayor's Transport Strategy. So by 2041, which is looking actually quite close now, it's less than 20 years, London is meant to go from 37% of trips by Londoners being made by car to 20%. That is a massive fall. That is a fall of nearly half. And the targets for some inner London trips are even larger. So 30% of trips between outer and inner London are currently made by car. This is meant to fall to 10%. So these are really substantial targets. Overall, there's meant to be a 33% fall in daily car trips. There's a target to reduce the number of cars owned by 10%. All this stuff is, if we achieved it, would have massive impacts for climate, would have very, very large co-benefits, health benefits and so on. But the ambition we need is really substantial. And I just needed to give you a couple of examples of the kind of policies, small encouragement doesn't achieve this kind of change. We need to do a load of ambitious things, and it will be hard. So one example is a study that colleagues and I have done on mini Holland schemes. And we've found that active travel infrastructure like bike tracks reduced car ownership by 3%. And when combined with low traffic neighbourhoods that restrict motor traffic, the reduction in car ownership was 6 or 7% after 2 or 3 years. So that's something quite substantial. Similar impacts were achieved in Amsterdam by making people wait to get residence parking permits. So in Amsterdam, you can't just get a residence parking permit, you have to go on a waiting list, and you have to pay market price while you wait. So you have to pay 3,000, 4,000 euros a year while you wait for a car parking permit. And that reduces car ownership by a similar amount, by around 2 percentage points a year. So these policies are challenging, they're controversial, but that's the level of ambition, maybe not those exact policies, but that's a level of ambition in a whole range of areas that we're going to need to achieve these kind of changes. So concluding thoughts, really, what I've been trying to get across, I suppose, is firstly that transport nationally is our highest emitting sector. Transport emissions have not been falling. That we need to pull as many levers as possible, especially given unintended consequences, from private ownership of electric cars leading to more driving, uncontrolled aviation growth, And also policies pulling in the other direction. You know, some things are pulling completely the other way. Fuel duty freezes for 12 years has led to more driving, the Silvertown Tunnel. Any effective policies to reduce emissions will be highly challenging to implement. Look at the debates in Greater Manchester around a clean air zone there, for instance. You know, in London, at least, you know, we do have the low emission zone, the ultra low emission zone. But reducing car use and increasing active and sustainable transport, walking, cycling, public transport use will have major co-benefits. It won't just be climate benefits, it will be other benefits like health and equity. And London has some ambitious targets, you know, it'll be a big challenge to reach them, but if we do, there'll be really large benefits. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.